All right, so we'll say good morning. We'll thank our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Adam and Yudit Benzev, for dedicating the Shur Midrashos this month in honor of their children, Jake, Sarina, and Rosie. Our week of learning sponsors, Yehuda and Jennifer Goodhart, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Jennifer's father, Yishaya Zalman ben Lazer. And our Daf Yomi sponsors today, the Plunka family, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Yaakov ben Meir Rabbeinu Tam. Sechet Tzadik Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah and the families in Nacham. With that, let us begin. I want to thank Reb Kalman Akiva for giving shir over Shabbos and Sunday. Thank you. Always an incredible job. With that, let us begin. So today's daf is Samech Daled 64, and we are going to pick up in Me'er Hashem at the two dots on Samech Daled Amud Aleph. So we have some very interesting Gemaras today. So today we're going to delve into the case in the Mishnah of Imshal Shem Meis Zeh Shalav. So also, this is just a little bit of background. Remember again, the Mishnah spoke about the case in the beginning of the parak on Samech Beis Amud Aleph. Spoke about the case of where one of the two animals, one of the two seirim dies. So the Mishnah made a distinction in terms of when the animal is dying, right? There are really three cases. Case number one is where the animal dies before Hagrala, before the lots were drawn. That's the easiest case. Before the lots were drawn, no one's been designated, just replace it. Right? If after the lots were drawn, so you've already decided which one was La Hashem, which one was La Azazel. So in that case, the Mishnah says this is what we're going to focus on. The Mishnah Higril, I'm just quoting from the Mishnah now for just a moment. If you already did the Hagril, you already drew the lottery, then, so the Gemara says, Yavi Zug Acher, then you have to go ahead and bring another pair of animals. You have to bring another pair of Seirim, and once again, draw a new lot. So again, we'll discuss what happens there. And then case number three is a situation, which was the last line of Rabbi Yehuda, of Nishpach Hadam. If what happens after Hagrava, so you've drawn the lottery, identities have been already assigned to each of the Seirim, you shechted the Seir LaHashem, you have the dam, but before you had a chance to go ahead and sprinkle the dam, it spilled. So what happens then to the Sira Mishtaleach? So again, we'll get to that case as well. But right now, we're focusing on the following situation. You've done your Hagrava, so you drew the lottery. So you've already decided which one is La Hashem, which one is La Azazel. So let's say just for illustration purposes. The Seir La Hashem dies. It now dies, so you bring another pair of goats, you do another lottery. So I'll say, obviously, the one that comes out La Hashem, that's good. What are you going to do with one La Hashem? What do you do with that? That's your replacement, right? That's your replacement. What's the Shaila? What do you do with the Seir La Azazel? Because we'll say now, at this point in time, you have two Seirim La Azazel. So obviously you can only offer one. So what are you doing with the two? So here we go. Says the quotation, Im shal shem meis zeh shal alav. So Amarav. So we'll say Rav Machlokes Rav Rabbi Yochanan. Amarav sheni shebezug rishon yikarev, sheni shebezug sheni yireh. So we'll say, what's the halacha? You use the seir lazaz. So we'll say, so one more time, just to be clear on the case. I had my pair of seirim. I did my hagral, did my lottery. One came up La Hashem, one came up La Azazel. It's amazing. That's always how the lottery works, right? Not a lot of options here, right? One is La Hashem, one is La Azazel. My Seir La Hashem dies. I bring another pair of animals. Conduct another lottery. The Seir La Hashem, easy. That's my replacement. Now, I have two Seirim La Azazel. Rav says, which one do you offer? Sheni Shebezug Rishon Yikarev, Sheni Shebezug Sheni Yireh. Essentially, Rav says, you keep the Seir LaAzazel from the first pair. There's nothing wrong with the first Seir LaAzazel. You keep the first Seir LaAzazel. What do you do with the second Seir LaAzazel? You go ahead and you let it graze. Now also we know letting it graze, it means what? You let it graze what? Till it develops a mum, then redeem it, use the money for sacrificial purposes. Now also, I want to point out, remember, the Seir LaAzazel is a carbon chatos. Even though we've seen other situations where you have a carbon chatas, two animals, let's say, and you achieve the tomin through one, generally the second one is left to die. This is what the Mishnah meant when it said that a chatas tzibur, a communal chatas, is not left to die. So instead, we let it graze, go ahead and develop a mum, and then sell it off. That's Rav. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Sheni Shebezug Rishon Yireh, Sheni Shebezug Sheni Kar. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. we go ahead and we let actually the La'azazel one from the first group graze, and we use the La'azazel one from what? From the second group. So we'll say Rabbi Yochanan's logic is, listen, once you're bringing that second, well, we're going to see what his logic is. What he's saying now is, pretty much, you're just going to use the second group. That's what's happening over here. Since your La Hashem here is coming from group number 2, you'll just use the Azazel one from group number 2 as well, and just let the Azazel one from group number 1 go ahead and graze until it develops. So we'll say, Fundamental Machlokes, Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Again, Rav telling me I'm going to use the Azazel from group 1, and let the Azazel from group 2 graze, develop a mum. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Yochanan saying, no, I'm going to use the Azazel from group 2 and let the Azazel from group 1 graze. Also, you understand, by the way, I'm just using the Shem Azazel example. It doesn't matter which one died, which one, that makes no difference in this case. So, what are they arguing about? What's the machlokes? So, Rav Savar, this is fascinating. Rav Savar Ba'ali Chaim Einon Nidchin. So, we'll say, we've seen this before. Rav holds that in general, animals, or sacrificial animals, are not nidchin. I will say nidchin means permanently set aside. Nidcha, to set aside. So let me read it. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan Savar Ba'ali Chaim Nidchin. Rabbi Yochanan holds that Ba'ali Chaim, sacrificial animals, can be or are permanently disqualified. So I'll say, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Ein nidchin, im ira lohen, shas psula, dain yichol nitakin, kishiz dabig lo achar, v'lo arminon, chol v'nitcha yitcha, ele b'shchutin. So let's listen to this case. Imagine the following scenario. Right, you have 2 sirim, Sir La Hashem, Sir La Azazel. Everything is good, right? Just one set of animals. Perfect. Now what happens? My Sir La Hashem dies. Both say, what's the status of my Sir La Azazel? What's the status? What's the status? Right? It's still Kodesh, but is it usable? No. Right? Right now, remember again, the Sir La Azazel is not usable without what? Without what? A La Hashem counterpart. Right? You remember, I say it's a pair, so it's only usable as a pair. So now again, I do have something that's called the Sir. It was designated as a Sir La Azazel. So it does have Kedusha, but it's unusable. That unusability in halach is called nidcha. It's set aside for non-use. So the shaila is like this. Once something becomes nidcha, does it become permanently set aside for non-use, or can it be rotated back into use? So we'll say, what's a good case? Oh, here's a great case. Right? I have a Sir La Hashem, Sir La Azazel. So my Sir La Hashem dies. La Hashem dies. The Azazel is nidcha. Great. I now bring another pair. I now have a new Sir La Hashem. Is my old Sir La Azazel from group 1, is it technically usable now? Right? Well, it's a machlokes. It depends. If you hold that Ba'alei Chaim nidchin, if you hold that once a carbon was set aside for non-use, it is forever unusable, then even now the emergence of the new Sir La Hashem does not allow for the use of the Azazel from group 1. However, if you hold Ba'alei Chaim Einon Nidchin, that no, something could become temporarily unusable, but once you go ahead and fix whatever was broken, it can be rotated back into use, then I could use that, we'll call that Azazel from group 1 as well. So I'll say the Gemara posits that that's the machlokes Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav holds Ein Ba'alei Chaim Nidchin. It's true that when the Sir La Hashem dies, the Azazel becomes unusable. But once you get a new Sir La Hashem from group number 2, the Azazel from group number 1 becomes usable again. Shalom al Yisrael. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan holds that no, Ba'alei Chaim Nidchin. Once pretty much you're disqualified, you're out. Once you're disqualified, you are out. So the Gemara says, "My time of derav." So we'll say, where does this come from? I'll just point out, by the way, that in the Olam HaShkafa, this is a profound machlokes as well. Do you hold Ba'alei Chaim Nidchin or Einon Nidchin? So we'll say, it's not just Ba'alei Chaim and not just animals, right? Ba'alei Chaim are people also. So how do we look at our mistakes in life? Right? Do we think that our mistakes profoundly disqualify us forever and remove any possibility of redemption? That once you're nidcha, you're nidcha. Once you mess up, you mess up. You're down and out. That's it. No redemption for you. Or do we hold Ba'alei Chaim nidchin, Einon nidchin? You could temporarily disqualify yourself, right? You could temporarily go ahead and do something which fundamentally pulls the rug out from under yourself and prevent yourself from any future growth. but Lamaisa redemption is always possible. So of course, it's machlokes by animals, sacrificial animals. So we know by people how we paskin. Right? By people we paskin that ba'alei chayim einan nidchin, that there's no such thing as permanent disqualification. Even if I make a mistake may sideline me for some amount of time, but it never has a permanent effect. Okay, and let's get back to animals. So I'll say, my time in Rav. So I'll say, where does Rav get this from? This incredible. My time in Rav. The Yolif b'mechusar zman. This is very interesting. So we'll say, Rav wants to learn this out from Mechusar Zman. We'll say, what's Mechusar? So it's in yesterday's daf. What's Mechusar Zman? Mechusar Zman is an animal that's less than 8 days old. Right? Remember again, you cannot offer up an animal as a carbon less than 8 days. Less than 8 days. So Mechusar Zman, Rav says like this. An animal before 8 days, we'll say, what's its status? What's its status? Unusable. Unusable. What happens once it reaches 8 days? Usable. So what do you see from here? Even if something was unusable, that does not render it unusable forever. So Ba'alei Chaim Eino Nitchin, it was unusable, now it became usable. You see that even being unusable for some amount of time does not render you forever unusable. So the Gemara says, "My time Rav the Yafet Mechusar Zman, Lav Afagav Dahashtalo Chazi." Even though now being before 8 days, it's not usable. Ki Hadar Michzi Shapir Dami. Once it becomes usable, it's great. Hachanami Loshna. So to Rav will posit the same thing over here. That halacha l'maisa, even though when the Seir La Hashem dies, the Seir La Azazel is unusable, but once you go ahead and get yourself a new Seir La Hashem, the Seir La Azazel once again becomes usable. So the Gemara says that's not a good comparison. Mi dami hasam lo is chazi klal hacha nira v'nitcha. See, I will say the reason why that's not really a good comparison is as follows. In the case of the animal less than 8 days old, it's never been usable. Right? So you both say the paradigmatic case of Ba'alei Chaim Nitchin really only applies when something was usable, something happened, rendered it unusable, and that factor which rendered it unusable has now been rectified or removed. So the shaila is, does it become usable again? That's the shaila Ba'alei Chaim Nitchin. An animal that was less than 8 days old never had a shasa kosher, right? Never had a period of usability. So we don't call that nidcha, right? I will say it's the same way that we wouldn't call an animal in utero nidcha, right? That animal's not nidcha. That animal just is simply unusable. It's just, just unusable. So therefore, again, that's not a good raya. Elo, hainu time Rav. So we'll say, so where does Rav get his logic from? Let's remember again, we're still going with the idea that the machlokes Rav and Rabbi Yochanan is in the concept of Ba'alei Chaim Nidchin. That once an animal is disqualified, does that disqualification remain forever? Or can the disqualification be removed if the circumstance which created disqualification is rectified? So Rav says, Ba'alei Chaim Einon Nidchin, if the disqualification is removed, the animal becomes usable again. And Rabbi Yochanan holds Ba'alei Chaim Nidchin. We're just trying to figure out where Rav gleans his shita from, where they both glean their shita from. Ella, Hainu Tamid Rav. So we'll say, here's where Rav gleans his shita from. The Yolef Mibal Mum over. What's this interesting case? What happens if an animal has what we call a mum over, right? A mum over. So we'll say, so what does it mean, a mum over? It means a blemish that heals. So an animal could have a mum, which disqualifies it from being offered, but the mum will heal. The mum will heal. Yeah, I'll tell you, okay, if we have time, I'll tell you, consider about mum over. I'll tell you right now. I remember a number of years ago, we had a scholar in residence in the shul. This was going back a long time ago, and he asked me how old I was at the time. He was an older gentleman, and I told him how old I was. He says, "You're so young." He says, "It's too young to be doing what you're doing." He said, "But don't worry about it." He said, "Youth, it's a mum over." I said, "It's a mum over. Don't worry about it. Goes away soon enough." Anyway, I said, "Thank you for coming." So Gemara says as follows: "Elo hainu taimid Rav diolef mi bal mum over." So let's listen to this. He learned it out from the case of mum over. So we'll say, what's the pshat of the mum over? This is fascinating. Bal mum over, la vafa gavlo chazi hashta, ki hadr michsi shapir dami. So we'll say, listen to this. If an animal has a mum over, right? Think about this just a moment. So the animal has a blemish. So so let's think about this. Before the blemish, what was the status of the animal? Before the blemish? Kosher. Blemish? Pasul. The blemish heals. So Rav will say, you could use the animal. Right? And by the way, nobody seems to disagree with that. Right? Nobody seems to disagree with that concept. So once the mum heals, then we're good to go. So too over here, the Gemara suggests, Rav holds, that halacha l'maisa, we should say the same thing. So again, remember, the Seir Lashem dies, Azazel becomes disqualified. New Seir Lashem, Azazel number 1 should once again become usable again. So the Gemara says, "V'hasam minalan." So by the way, where do you know that halacha by a bal mum over that once the mum heals, halacha l'maisa again, the animal is usable again. Dichsiv ki mashchasam bahem mum bam. As the pasuk says, ki mashchasam bahem. Ultimately, again, the disqualification or literally destructiveness is in it. Mum bam. The mum is in the animal. Mum bam hu de lo yeratzu. It's only when the animal has the mum that the animal is sacrificially unusable. Ha'avar muman yeratzu. But if the mum goes away, the animal is usable. So therefore I will say, halacha l'maisa, Rav is going to learn out his stance from bal mum over. Just like in a case of a mum over, once the mum heals, the animal is usable again. So it's usable, unusable during the mum, but once the mum heals, the animal is usable again. So to over here, the Seir La'azazel it was usable when its counterpart was alive. Then its counterpart died, the Seir La'Hashem died, unusable. When you do a second lottery, now you have a replacement Seir La'Hashem. The first Seir La'azazel should once again become usable. So what does Rabbi Yochanan do with this? Because remember again, Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Rabbi Yochanan holds Bali Chaim Nidchin that once the Seir La'azazel, the first Seir La'azazel set aside for non-use, you can't use it again. So where does he learn? So what does he do with this whole drasha? Rabbi Yochanan mi'et rachmana bahem. Haim hu d'chi avar muman yiratzu. Hakol d'chuyin hol v'nitchu nitchu. Sorry, hol v'nitchu nitchu. But Rabbi Yochanan will say, you're right, Rav. I agree with you by a mum over. I agree with you in that case by a blemish that heals. But ultimately, again, the Torah goes out of its way to go ahead and discuss and highlight the idea that this halacha is unique to a bal mum over. The Gemara says it's only bahem. It's mi'et rachmana bahem. The Torah says bahem in it. It's only dafka kimash chasam bahem mum bam. It's only in this specific circumstance where after the disqualification goes away, that the animal once again becomes fit. But that doesn't apply in other cases. In other cases, what do we say? Hoel v'nidcha, nidcha. Alright, it's only by mum over where Rabbi Yochanan will agree with Rav, but in the other cases of disqualification, once the sacrificial animal is disqualified, the disqualification remains forever. V'Rav, hahu bahem, Beinaihu delo mirtzu. So we'll say Rav says that bahem comes to teach you a different halacha. We'll say now they're just arguing on the drasha. That bahem comes to teach you a different drasha. What's the different drasha? Beinaihu delo mirtzu. That ultimately, again, when the animal has a mum by itself, in other words, when that animal stands alone, it cannot be used as a sacrificial item. Ha ayidei tarobes mirtzu. This is very interesting. What happens if that animal gets mixed in with other animals? Or for example, really it doesn't mean the animal, rather it means limbs of the blemished animal gets mixed in with other animals. For example, kidisnan, evarim tmimim be'evarim ba'ali mumin. We'll say, what happens if you know that you have sacrificial limbs from a complete animal, which means a kosher karban, mixed in with limbs from an animal that has a mum. We'll say, in other words, in this case over here, you shechted an animal, a karban, and then only after you did the hakrava, you realize that it's a balmum. And now you have sacrificial limbs all mixed together. Limbs from kosher karbanos, limbs from bali mumin. So what do you do? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Lazar Omer, Im karav arosh shel echan mehem, yikrivu kol haroshin kulon. Karav shel echan mehen, yikrivu kol hakra'ayim kulon. So Rabbi Lazar says essentially, whatever you've already offered, offer up that unit. So if you offered up the head, right, you could offer up all of the heads. You offered up the legs, you could offer up all of the legs. In other words, whatever you've done, but don't do the rest. The Chum say, afilu kervu kulan chutz ne'echa mehem yetzi lebeis hasheva. Chum say, no. Whatever you've offered, obviously you've offered already, but whatever you haven't offered, ultimately take out to the beis hasheva. Beis hasheva means you burn it outside of the beis hamikdash. Remember, again, I will say, in general, is offering up the limbs a necessity for the effectiveness of a karban? No. Remember again, once we get past Zrika, once we get to Zrika, we're good. We're good. So the Chum say, why enter into the world of doubt? If whatever you burnt already. You can't do anything about that. But Lamai say anything else, take out to the Beis HaSreifa. V'idach, suppose Rabbi Yochanan will say, Naf galei mi bam bahem. So ultimately, Rabbi Yochanan will learn this out from the drasha of bam bahem. V'idach, bam bahem lo darish. Good. So we'll say in other words, because it says both bam and bahem, and Rav doesn't darshan bam bahem. Fine. Ulu Rav. So we'll say, so the Gemara is suggesting, let's refocus over for just a moment. There are machlokes, so we'll say about, do we go ahead and now remember, I have 2 seirim, Seir LaHashem dies, I do another lottery, bring another 2 goats, I have now my replacement Seir LaHashem, but I now also have a second Seir LaAzazel. So which Seir LaAzazel am I using for the service? Rav says, number 1, Seir LaAzazel from the first group. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, Seir LaAzazel from the second group. And now the Gemara is positing that their machlokes is, do we say Ba'alei Chayim nitchin or Einon nitchin? Do we say once a carbon has been disqualified, that disqualification remains forever or not? Rav holds the disqualification is not eternal, right? And therefore, again, once you go ahead and remedy the disqualification, the carbon becomes usable again. Therefore, again, the Seir LaAzazel was only disqualified when there was no counterpart. But once you find it a counterpart, another Seir LaHashem, Seir LaAzazel number 1 once again becomes usable. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, once disqualified sacrificially, forever disqualified sacrificially. Where does Rav get his shita from? Bal mum over. That's where Rav's raya comes from. Beautiful. The Gemara says, Ulu Rav, nihi nami de ba'alei chayim eno nitchin. Supposed to listen to this. So the Gemara says, fine. Now I understand where Rav is coming from. I now understand where he's coming from. So ba'alei chayim eno nitchin. Well, if that's the case, I boy hainakriv. Why does Rav say I have to use seir number 1? According to Rav, what should be the halacha? I should be able to use what? Whichever one I want. Right? Because now I really do have a choice. I have 2 valid seirim. So let me use seir number 1, let me use seir number 2. Why does Rav Dafka say I have to use seir number 1? Amar Rava, Rav Savarlak Rabbi Yossi. Oh, Rav holds like Rabbi Yossi. What does Rabbi Yossi say? The Amar mitzvah berishon. Because Rabbi Yossi says in general, the mitzvah is always used to use the first thing. To always use the first thing. Rabbi Yossi says the Gemara, okay, which Rabbi Yossi are you referring to? Which Rabbi Yossi? Inema Rabbi Yossi de Kupos. Rabbi Yossi a little bit taking us back to Shkalim. If we want to say it's Rabbi Yossi by Kupos, right by the collection boxes, the shofros. This none. Shalosh kupos, shalosh sin. You have 3 boxes, collection boxes, each holding 3 sin. Shevahen tarmines halishka. We'll say from them you remove money for the karbanos sibur. V'kasev alein aleph beis gimel. And it says aleph beis gimel on these kupos. V'tanya am Rabbi Yossi. Lama kasev alein aleph beis gimel. Why do you have to number them or letter them? Aleph beis gimel. Leida eiza mehem nisrama rishon. Lahavi emena rishon. Shemitzvah berishon. Rabbi Yossi says, because I want to know which one filled up first, because I want to take from the coins of the ones that filled up first. Why? Mitzvah berishon. So we'll say, here you see Rabbi Yossi holds that in general. I will say, mitzvah, if you think about it, mitzvah berishon is just like it's just Rabbi Yossi's like logical stance, right? This is the first item that was set aside for the mitzvah, and therefore again, this should be the first item taken out. Right, where's Rachmiel Noodleman? I saw him here before. Right, is Rachmiel here? Okay, I saw him here before. Right, this is FIFO. Right, it's FIFO. Right, it's our first in, first out. Right, so that's mitzvah berishon. So the Gemara says, Dilma shiny hasam deba idna dis chazi kamaisa lo is chazi basraisa. That's not really a good raya. Why? Because in the case of shkalim, I will say, remember again, it's possible that when the coins were there in the first collection box, they were not yet there in the second one. So in other words, you don't necessarily have items that are concurrently present. So therefore, again, maybe Rabbi Yossi holds mitzvah berishon because the first one was there even before the second one ever existed. Ela Rabbi Yossi de Pesach. Rather, it has to, when we see that Rabbi Yossi holds mitzvah berishon, it's Rabbi Yossi of Pesach. What Rabbi Yossi of Pesach? Say this nan, interesting case. Hamafresh pischo va'avad. Let's listen to this case. I separated out a current Pesach and I lost my carbon. Now I lost my car also before I shechted it. Right? In other words, it ran away. It ran away. What happens? V'hefresh acher tachtov, and Baruch Hashem, I find it. And I say, I find it before Chatzos on Erev Pesach. So now comes Chatzos, what do I have? What do I have? 2 lambs. 2 lambs. So the Gemara's Vakran, the Msar Rishon, Varishnein Omdin, and they're both standing right in front of me now. So what's the Shaila? What's the Shaila? Which one should I use? So the Gemara says, Eiza mehem sheyirtze yikare divrei chachamim. The Chacham say, you use whichever one you want. Right? You use whichever one. And both say, by the way, what's the status of the second one? Shlamim. Shlamim. Right? The most remember again, it's a shlamim you offer it up whenever you want. It's carbon shlamim. Beautiful. Rabbi Yossi says, no, mitzvah berishon. Rabbi Yossi says, no, you really should go ahead and use the rishon. Ultimately, again, because Rabbi Yossi says, listen, this is the first. Rabbi says, so again, this Rishon just says, this is the first thing you consecrated. This is the first thing you consecrated, and therefore you should go ahead and use it. However, again, what the caveat Rabbi Yossi does give is, if the second one is more zaftig, right, the second one is a nicer carbon, then you could go ahead, then ultimately, again, the issue is, so this is Rabbi Yossi. There's a profound most Rabbi Yossi sheet also in Mitzvah Rishon, which is also a yisod of finish up what you started. I will say sometimes the greatest challenge in life is we get started on things because there's that new project, that new initiative, excitement, and then what happens? It gets lost, and then I move on to something else. And so many of us have closets full of half-started projects, right? Of half-started initiatives, of dreams that began to materialize but kind of failed to launch. Rabbi Yossi says, mitzvah berishon. Whatever you started, finish it up. Finish it up, right? You went ahead, you started this Karm Pesach, finish up with this Karm Pesach. You started with the Ishkalim, finish up with the Ishkalim. You started with this Seir La'azazel, finish up with this Seir La'azazel. Whatever you start in life, finish it before you move on to something else. So therefore, again, just to tie this up for just a moment. So therefore, the Gemara is suggesting that the Shita of Rav is really comprised of 2 parts. Right? Rav has a 2-part Shita, 2-pronged Shita. Part number 1 is Ba'alei Chaim Einon Nidchin. That even if a carbon becomes disqualified, if the disqualifying factor is remedied and removed, the carbon once again becomes usable. So therefore, again, Rav says you could use Seir La'azazel number 1 because now it has a new counterpart of a Seir La'Hashem from group number 2. But why does Rav want me dafka to use Seir number 1? I understand if Rav says you can use Seir number 1 if you want to, La'azazel number 1 if you want to, but why do I have to? Because Rav also says Rabbi Yossi of mitzvah berishon. That whenever you have multiple animals with the same sacrificial identity, it is better to use the first animal consecrated. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava. Rava says, Teika masnisin kavase derav, ubraisa kavase derav Yochanan. It was very interesting. So Rav suggests that the Mishnah really reflects the view of Rav, and we have a Braisa which reflects the view of Rabbi Yochanan. So let's analyze. So masnisin kavase derav, our Mishnah reflects the view of Rav, Diktani im shal shem meis. Because remember, we'll say, what was the Mishnah's case? The Mishnah's example was, I have my Seir La'Hashem, my Seir La'azazel. My Seir La'Hashem dies. And then what happens? The Mishnah goes in and says, Zeh sha'ala alav agora l'shem yiskayim tachtov v'idach kidikoi koi. So I will say, again, remember, if you remember the lashon of the Mishnah, so the Mishnah said, right, I have my 2 Seirim, Seir La'Hashem, Seir La'azazel. My Seir La'Hashem dies. So remember again, what's the process of the Mishnah? I'm just going to read, I'm quoting you from the Mishnah now. Yavi zug acher, bring another pair of animals. V'yagril aleim, conduct another lottery. V'yomar im shal shem meis, zeh sha'ala hagora l'shem yiskayim tachtov. And what's the lashon of the Mishnah is that the one that comes out with the lottery of La'Hashem is the replacement. What doesn't the Mishnah make any mention of? The Azazel. So Rava is suggesting, based on that, you see that according to the Mishnah, why doesn't the Mishnah make any mention of the Seir La'azazel? Because the Mishnah presupposes that which Azazel goat are you using? Number 1. Number one, which we'll say is actually it's an excellent diuk, right? Remember again about because if you are using Seir La'azazel number 2, really the Mishnah should have told me that halacha l'maisa I'm using Seir number 2. The fact that the Mishnah doesn't say anything about the Seir La'azazel, rather again look once more. The Gemara says the Kani Imshal Shemes, right? When the Seir number 1 of La Hashem dies, Zesh Alav Alav Agar La Hashem is kind of the new replacement Seir La Hashem becomes Seir La Hashem. And again, v'idach kidekai kai. But yet, we assume the Mishnah presupposes that the Seir La'azazel remains as is, which tells me that according to the Mishnah, it's clear I'm using Seir number 1. Seir La'azazel number 1, like the position of Rav. Fine, so we'll say, so the Mishnah is in line with the position of Rav. Brayse kavas Rabbi Yochanan, but I have a brayse like Rabbi Yochanan. Also, again, Rabbi Yochanan holds that which Seir La'azazel do you use? Number 2, why? Let's just remember this, why? Why? Ba'alei Chayim Nitchin. Right? Because Rabbi Yochanan holds, we haven't really spent so much time on the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan, but once a carbon is disqualified, it remains disqualified. So what is a diktani? Because we learned Sheni, Eni Odeya, Im Sheni Shebazug, Rishon, Im Sheni Shebazug Sheni. Because we'll say ultimately, again, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said Sheni. You go ahead and you bring a second one. So I don't know, what is that referring to? Is that referring to the Sheni Shebezug Rishon? Is that telling me that ultimately, again, I should be using the Seir La'azazel from the first group, Im Sheni Shebezug Sheni? Or should I be using the second goat, which is the Seir La'azazel, from the second group? Kishu Omer Ya'amod Chai, when it says ultimately, again, it shall be standing living, Velo Shechavero Meis. So I will say, interestingly enough, so what Rabbi Yochanan is positing is as follows. The Torah calls the Seir La'azazel the Sheni, right? It calls it the Sheni. So the Gemara says, well, first off, I'm sorry, take a look at Rashi just a moment. Sheni Eni Odea, Amasnisa Koi, Sheni Sheshaninu Alav Yira. Let me quote you from the Mishnah again. So Rabbi Yochanan says like this. Rabbi Yochanan says that after you go ahead, right? So remember again, the Seir Hashem dies, I bring a brand new pair of goats, do a new lottery, get my replacement Seir Hashem. Good. Then the Mishnah said, V'hasheni yira ad sheyistaiv. The second one grazes until it develops a mum, and then goes ahead and is sold off. So Rabbi Yochanan says, this is Sheni, Eni Odea im Sheni Shebezug Rishon, im Sheni Shebezug Sheni. Rabbi Yochanan will say, that's a very ambiguous lashon. Right? So the Mishnah says, now obviously I will say, I know I have an issue, right? What's my issue? I have 2 Seirim La'azazel. So obviously I can only offer up one of them. So the Mishnah says the second one, which is the surplus Seir La'azazel, goes out to graze until it develops a mum, then you sell it off, use the money for sacrificial purposes. So Rabbi Yochanan says, here's the problem. I don't know which Sheni the Mishnah is referring to. Right? The Gemara says, Eini Odeh im Sheni Shebezug Rishon, im Sheni Shebezug Sheni. I don't know, is it referring to the second Seir of group number 1, or the second Seir of group number 2, which one is the Sheni, which one is the surplus Seir La'azazel? Kishu Omer, Ya'amod Chai. Also, when the Pasuk says, Ya'amod Chai lefnei Hashem, right? The Pasuk speaks about the Seirim and says they have to be standing living before, or still standing living, V'lo Shechavero Meis. So both say the din of Seir La'azazel has to be one that is standing together with its living counterpart, and not a Seir La'azazel whose counterpart has died. Look at Rashi just a moment. So v'lo shechavero meis, v'lo zeh shechavero meis. So Rabbi Yochanan posits you cannot use a Seir La'azazel whose counterpart has died. Ya'amod chai v'lo shekvar amar. Look at Rashi. V'nitche al yedei misas chavero v'achshav huba lachzor v'la'amod ya'amod chai amida achos. Both say this is very interesting. Rabbi Yochanan posits the Braisa that the pasuk says Ya'amod Chai Lefnei Hashem, that the Seir La'azazel has to stand together with its living counterpart before Hashem. The Seir La'azazel only gets to stand one time. Ya'amod Chai is singular. Ya'amod is singular, right? Stand singular before Hashem. Rabbi Yochanan posits the Seir La'azazel could only stand one time before Hashem with its counterpart. If you use this Seir of group number 1, how many times is it standing before Hashem? Twice. One time with its first Seir LaHashem alav shalom, right? And then the second time with the second seir la Hashem, yibadal l'chaim tovim l'shalom, right? So we'll say, so again, Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't work that way. It's one amida. It's only one standing per seir la azazel. Therefore, by definition, you must only be using the seir la azazel from the second group. Velos, the Gemara says, Kishu Omer Yamor Chai, Velos Shechaveiro Meis. It's got to be standing with its living counterpart, and to not use a seir la azazel whose counterpart has died. So my mashma, so what's here the Gemara spells out, my mashma Yamor Chai. I don't understand, what's the drush of Yamor Chai? It shall stand living. Below Shekvar Amad. So the Yamor Chai means it must be standing now, and not that it already stood. In other words, every seir gets one amida before Hashem, right? That's when you draw the lots, you assign the identities, and then everybody moves on. The seir move on. If you go ahead and you use the seir from group number 1, that seir effectively stands before God twice. And Rabbi Yochanan says that's just not part of the process. So I just want to point out something very interesting. That really what you see, that according to Rabbi Yochanan, really again, his Iker Shita, right, his core idea is Ba'alei Chaim Nidchin. Once the animal becomes disqualified, it's disqualified. That's like the halachic principle. The Gemara is quoting this additional brayso that there's also according to Rabbi Yochanan a pasuk problem. That the pasuk says when describing the process for the seir Yamod Chai, the seirim stand before God once. And if you end up using seir la azazel number 1 with seir la Hashem from group number 2, effectively, Seir La Azazel number 1 has 2 amidos. It stood with Seir La Hashem number 1, and now it's going to stand with Seir La Hashem number 2. And that's just in violation of the biblical process. So Tnan, we learned, Va'od Am Rabbi Yehuda. Further, we're going to say this, so this is quoting the end of the Mishnah. Va'od Am Rabbi Yehuda, Nishbach Adam Yamos Mishtalech. So also we'll get into this case. Rabbi Yochanan says as follows. Rabbi Yehuda says as follows. In this case, Rabbi say, I have already shechted the Seir La Hashem. I'm already about to engage in the blood service, and on my way, the Kohen Gadol's way to engage in the blood service, he spills the blood. He spills all the blood. In that case, Yamos HaMishtaleach. Ultimately, again, the Mishtaleach is put to death. So the Gemara says, Meis HaMishtaleach. Similarly, again, if the Mishtaleach died, Yishbo Chadam. Ultimately, again, the blood is spilled out. So Bishlam, Rabbi Yochanan, Dor Bali Chaim Nitchin. So this case makes sense according to Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Because Rabbi Yochanan holds, essentially, once something becomes disqualified, it's forever disqualified. So if you go ahead and you spill the blood, the mishtaleach, which is the seir la azazel, is no longer usable. You let it die, right? Ultimately, again, if the mishtaleach dies, you have to spill out the blood because it's unusable. Mishum hachi yamos ha-mishtaleach ella l'Rav dar Bali Chaim eno nitchin amay yamos mishtaleach. But we'll say according to Rav, who holds Bali Chaim are not nitchin. So even in a case where you spilled the blood, why does the seir la azazel have to die? Amaya masa mishtaleach. Amar l'charav alibud Rabbi Yehuda lo kamina ki kamina libud Rabban. Rav will say, listen, no, you're mixing and matching. The end of the Mishnah, which reflects this view of Rabbi Yehuda, is a different shita. Rav says, I will admit the fact that my position is not in conformance with Rabbi Yehuda. My position is conformance with the view of the Rabbanon, which is the view that is espoused in the beginning of the Mishnah. So Bishlam Rav Baha Pligi Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanon. So according to Rav, ultimately again, this is the point of contention between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon. So we'll say if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says, actually we have to look at Rashi here. Bishlam Rav Baha Pligi Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanon. El Rabbi Yochanan b'may Pligi. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, ultimately again, what are the Rabbanon and Rabbi Yehuda arguing about? So ultimately, I say their point of contention would be that which Rava said, that the Mishnah aligns with the position of Rav. So both say the Gemara just kind of added that last piece, and we'll loop back to that for just a moment. But before we move on, who do we paskin like? Boss, I'm going to give you the halacha l'maisa a little bit prematurely, only because it's going to help us a little bit in the formulation of tomorrow's daf as well. So we'll say we kind of stand here with a dramatic machlokes, right? So first of all, a more general machlokes of Baalei Chaim Nidchin or Baalei Chaim Einon Nidchin. Right? Ultimately, again, our sacrificial animals, if they're disqualified, is that disqualification eternal or not? Rav says it is not. Once you take care of the disqualifying factor, the animal becomes usable again. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Once disqualified, forever disqualified. Machlokes will say, so again, how do we apply that to this case? I have Masir LaHashem, Sir LaAzazel, Sir LaHashem dies. We know the process. Bring another 2 pairs. Bring another 2 animals. Do another lottery, and now find my Sir LaHashem. Great. So I have my replacement Sir LaHashem. Which Sir LaAzazel do I use? So Rav will say number 1. Rabbi Yochanan will say number 2. Why does Rav say number 1? Rav should really say what? Whichever one you want. Why does Rav Dafka say number 1? Rabbi Yossi, mitzvah rishos. Well, listen to this. So the Rambam Paskins in Hilchos Yom Kippurim, Perek He Halacha Tesvav. Meis Echad Mehen. If one of the animals dies. So we'll say, so again, obviously, it's obvious. The Rambam does begin with the case of if one of the animals died before you did the lottery, that's the easy case. What do you do if the animal dies before the lottery? What do you do? Just bring another animal. That's easy. In Meshehigral Meis, Yavil Shnayim, Viagril Aleim Betchila, Bera Ezu Shemes. Im Hayashal Shem, Omer Zesh Allah Vagor Hashem is Kaim Tachtov. So listen to this. So he goes on, he says, Vim Shames, fine. So whichever animal died, so you bring another set of animals, do the lottery. So let's just go with the simple example that the Mishnah used. If the Seir LaHashem died, you bring another 2 animals, do a lottery, and halacha l'maisa, whichever one comes up LaHashem, that is the replacement animal. Now listen to this. V'hasheni min hashnayim shigra leim besof, yira ad shipo bomum, v'makar v'yiplu damav linadava. And both say the Rambam Paskins, like Rav. That ultimately, again, the second animal of the second pair. The second animal of the second is the animal that I didn't really need. I don't need that animal. So in our example, we've been using the entire time the Seir LaAzazel. So Seir LaAzazel from group number 2, which is the Seir LaAzazel that I don't really need. Halacha l'maisa, again, what do you do with that Seir? Nothing. You let it graze, develop a mum, then sell it off, and ultimately, again, the proceeds used for Nedava. So the Rambam Paskins halacha l'maisa like Rav. Number 1, that Baalei Chaim Eino Nitchin, that's really the meta principle, right? Baalei Chaim Eino Nitchin, even after a sacrificial animal has been disqualified, if disqualification is remedied, the animal once again becomes usable, and halacha l'maisa, I will use the Seir LaAzazel from group number 1, and the Seir LaAzazel from group number 2, set out the pasture, develop a mum, use the proceeds for an adar. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Emir Hashem with this sugya tomorrow.